Hey, everybody. So, we're moving on to a new text. This week, we will begin reading a contemporary play from the celebrated playwright Lynn Nottage. Her 2017 play, Sweat, explores the working class of Reading, Pennsylvania, that suffered the loss of manufacturing jobs as wealthy industrialists shipped production overseas so they could pay cheaper labor costs. So, this loss of manufacturing jobs is facilitated by the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA. And the characters mention this in scene 2. It's this struggle for jobs that is the backdrop of the characters' struggle for legitimacy in a world that seems to have forgotten about them. The action takes place mostly in a neighborhood bar, tended by Stan, a former employee of the local factory that employs or used to employ most of the characters in the neighborhood. The factory is a major source of employment for this area, and the community is dependent upon these manufacturing jobs. One thing this play shows us is how economic circumstances and anxieties can bring about real tension between racial groups that sometimes leads to violence. Act 1, and Act 2 for that matter, begin with a scene from 2008. Jason, a young white American man, and Chris, a young black American man, are both recently paroled and are nervous about running into each other because they had committed a crime together in the past. In scene 1, they meet with their parole officer, a black man named Evan. We see that Jason emerges from jail with white supremacist symbols tattooed on his face. And we can infer that while in jail, he became involved with the Nazis, even though he was good friends with Chris, who was black, before going to jail for committing some type of crime with him. We don't really know what that crime is yet. Scenes 2 to 7 are set back in 2000, 8 years earlier. So the structure of the play is that we see the final result of the action in the very beginning, Chris and Jason getting out of jail. And then in later scenes, we learn what led up to that crime and what exactly that crime was that they committed. So we meet most of the characters in scene 2 at a birthday party for Tracy, a white woman in her 40s and the mother of Jason. She is with Cynthia, a black woman of the same age and mother of Chris, and Jessie, an Italian-American woman of that same age who is visibly drunk. And many of the scenes we see her in, she's drunk. Jessie serves as comic relief sometimes, like when we overhear her falling down in the bathroom. And although it is tragic that she goes through most of her life intoxicated, we hear also the story of Brucey, Chris's dad and the former husband of Cynthia, who was a Union hero in the past, but who now struggles with drug and alcohol addiction. Cynthia tells the story of how he stole several things from her house, including her pet fish, to buy drugs, and then came home as if nothing happened. Again, on the surface, the substance abuse seems comic, but it is really a symptom of something much more troubling underneath. We see a little foreshadowing of future racial tensions, too, when Tracy, who says she doesn't know what NAFTA is, and she says it sounds like a laxative. She assumes that Oscar, who is a worker at the bar, who is Colombian American, she assumes that he would know where to find someone to commit arson. And he says, well, why do you think I would know? I don't know where I would find someone who you could pay to burn down your house. She says, you Puerto Ricans are burning shit down all over Reading. You gotta know. Oscar says, well, I'm Colombian and I don't know. Tracy says, yeah, right. And so this racism from Tracy gets worse as the play goes on. In scene 3, we meet Jason and Chris while they were good friends. Remember, this was back in 2000. And Oscar is in the scene, but he doesn't speak. And this happens in several scenes. Our narrator tells us that he is a quiet but visible presence throughout the scene, watching, listening, and working. So pay attention to that and pay attention to Oscar. In scene 4, we meet Brucey, a black man in his 40s, the ex-husband of Cynthia and the father of Chris. He and Stan are talking about the strike at the Olsted's factory, where Brucey used to work before he and other union members were locked out. So this is on my page 37 to 38. Brucey is saying how he's feeling very discouraged with the union negotiations. And he says, tells us a story. Last week, he says, I was at the union office signing up for some bullshit training, and this old white cat, whatever, gets in my face, talking about how we took his job. We? I asked him who he was talking about, and he pointed at me. Me? So I said, if you ain't noticed, I'm in the same fucking line as you. Hello? You'd think that would shut him down, but no. He's a scratch in the vinyl going on and on about us coming here and ruining everything, like I'm fresh off the boat or some shit. He doesn't know my biography. October 2nd, 1952, my father picked his last bale of cotton. He packed his razor and a Bible and headed north. 10 days later, he had a job at Dixon's Hosieries. He clawed his way up from the filth of the yard to union rep, fighting for fucking assholes just like that cat. So, I don't understand it. This damn blame game. I've got enough of that in my marriage. I think what Brucey says here is very insightful. I think that's one of those moments in the play when a character actually, says what the whole play is about. It's this blame game. I think this blame game is just what this play explores. So what economic and cultural and interpersonal influences lead to racism, to that blame game, and racial violence? Later in this scene, Brucey learns that his son Chris was accepted into college and wanted to become a teacher. Brucey is not happy about this because he doesn't want him to leave a good-paying job at the factory. But Chris wants more in his life. He doesn't just want that same factory job that everyone seems to have. This brings me to another important element of the play that we need to pay attention to, and that is parent-child relationships. This play shows intergenerational struggles. Chris and Jason were both in jail for committing a crime together. Their parents are friends, and I think we also see how their relationship with their parents and their parents' conflicts can contribute to their view of society and their place in it. Then in scene 5, the girls are celebrating Cynthia's promotion. Cynthia, Tracy, and a couple other people applied to be a manager at the factory, and Cynthia got the job. Tracy goes outside to smoke and runs back into Oscar. Oscar tries to bum a cigarette from her, and she at first refuses. But here we witness to a little more exploration of her racism. We see her anger toward Latino people get even worse. Oscar asks her about Olsted's, the factory where everybody works, who was shut out workers because there was a poster at the Latino Community Center for part-time jobs there. So he's asking about the place. But what Tracy realizes is what Brucey says earlier in scene 4 is coming true. The management of the plant is recruiting Spanish speakers to replace the union workers that are on strike so that they can pay lower wages for the same kind of labor. Tracy's already bitter that she didn't get the promotion. She claims it was sexual harassment from a superior that caused her not to get it. And we get a little more insight into why she feels this animosity toward Oscar and other Spanish speakers. She talks about this idealized past when one was respected for their craftsmanship, when you could see the products of their labor in everyday life. And this is on my page 49. And this is a relatively long quote, so let me quickly. She says, yeah. Oscar tells her he was born in Berks County. She doesn't believe him. She says, yeah, well, my family's been here a long time, since the 20s, okay? They built the house that I live in. They built this town. My grandfather was German, and he could build anything. Cabinets, fine furniture, anything. He had these amazing hands. Sturdy, meaty, real firm. You couldn't shake his hand without feeling his presence, feeling his power. And those hands, let me tell you, they were solid worker hands, and they really, really knew how to make things. Beautiful things. I'm not talking about now, hey, you got these guys who can patch a hole with spackle and think they're the shit. My grandfather was the real thing, a craftsman. And I remember when I was a kid, I mean like 8 or 9, we'd go downtown to Penn with Opa to walk and look in store windows. Downtown was real nice back then. You get dressed up to go shopping. You know, Pomeroy's, Whitner's, whatever. I felt really special because he was this big strapping man and people gave him room. But what I really loved was he'd take me to office buildings, banks, you name it, and he'd point out the woodwork. And if you got really, really close, he'd show you some detail that he'd carved for me. An apple blossom. Really, that's what I'm talking about. It was back when if you worked with your hands, people respected you for it. It was a gift. But now there's nothing on Penn. You go into the buildings, the walls are covered over with sheetrock, the wood painted gray or some ungodly color, and it just makes me sad. This is the second time we hear a character, a worker from Olmsted's, looking toward their past for justification for them to have a good paying job in the present. Brucey talks about, his father picking cotton back in 1952. Tracy's describing her roots in this part of the country. And more importantly, though, it is this history that supplies the sense of legitimacy to a working class person who, in these great economic developments like the ones we see mentioned in the news at the beginning of every scene, these great economic developments, they're forgotten. In the next scene, we learn about Jessie, while she's sober enough to talk, and her plans to travel. She wanted to travel the world before she ended up at Olmsted's. So this factory job is, she wanted more from life than just that. And then in the last scene, the plot thickens. There's a list of names posted on the factory doors, and Chris and Jason's names are on it. It appears they are being laid off. And, because we saw that poster that Oscar brought up, they're essentially being replaced with cheaper labor. Brucey, a seasoned union man, is not surprised when he finds this out. So, we see thus far how a factory laying off people and breaking unions causes tensions in the working class community as people struggle for jobs and struggle to define a narrative that justifies their belonging and why they deserve to be gainfully employed. So, for this discussion board, I have a few questions for you to address this week. First, what is the effect of these news blips in the beginning of each scene? Every scene begins with national news and then local news from Reading. So, why do you think Nottage includes them, and what purpose do they serve? How do they shed light on the action and the conflicts in the play? Next, look closely at the families depicted here. Tracy and her son Jason, his father has passed away, and then Cynthia, Brucey, and Chris. So for Tracy and Jason, remember, the play begins with Jason getting out of jail and his face covered with white supremacist tattoos. From what we've learned so far about him and his mother Tracy, why do you think he joined a white supremacist gang while in prison? Do we see Tracy practice racism? Yes. What kind of racism comes from her? And do you think she's an influence on him? Then, for Cynthia, Brucey, and Chris, what kinds of struggles and successes do they experience? And how have these outside circumstances, like economic issues, finding a job at the plant, have also affected their home life and their interpersonal relationships? And lastly, what do you think is the cause of the racial tension in this play? And then, do you think that is also a cause of racial tension in the real world? Can you think of an example in the real world where maybe an economic circumstance ends up feeding into or creating racial tension? So I look forward to hearing your thoughts here. Remember that if you did not purchase a copy of the book, there is a link in the module to a copy of this in the library. It's an ebook, so you can access it if you have your DSU ID. You need that ID number to log into the library. So you'll find that link in the module. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion board. I'll see you there.